Hey, what's going on, everybody? Welcome to the Sentinels of Liberty podcast. I am your host, Redbeard, and I appreciate every one of you for joining me this evening. The conversation tonight is going to be surrounding the sunken cost state and essentially how America doubles down on failure and sacrifices liberty all the same. Now, you might be wondering, what does this all entail? We'll get to that. We'll find that out. It may be a little bit of a longer conversation here today, but I hope that each and every one of you enjoys the topics here today. And if you do like what it is that you hear, or you find it interesting, or it's something that maybe gets you to think a little bit differently, or whatever the case might be, then feel free to hit that like button, perhaps even toss me a subscribe, share to whomever or wherever you feel it is necessary, and even leave a comment down below. It really does help with the algorithm. It helps kind of keep me in the cycle, so then that way I can get a little bit more into the YouTube verse, as you will, and into other areas respectively. All of your help and everything is really, really appreciated. So without further ado, let's get into the conversation at hand. So why did I do this? Well, I feel that building off of the initial conversations that I've had, we've seen kind of this recognition or this situation of a failure, not even really being able to recognize or accept failure, or to admit that there's errors, that there's a mistake or something like that that's being made. And it's, well, this is going to be a little bit more US centric. It is not something that is particularly specific to the United States. It is something that I suppose one could say pertains to a lot of different governments, a lot of different countries. But for today, we're going to be using the United States as an example. Now let's kind of move into things here. So let's create a frame, if we will. The defining characteristics, at least as I kind of see it anyways, of the current US federal government is, it's not solely based off of like an ideology, a party, or even really like a general incompetence, albeit there is enough of that typically tends to go around. However, I do think that it is like an institutional refusal to admit error, admit that something is wrong, to admit that something did go wrong, right? But what is this refusal ultimately manifests itself in? Well, there's a couple different things that we can start to look at here to help it kind of take some shape. So a few of these things are perpetual self-congratulation, the old pat on the back, the self-congratulatory, we're perfect in every way, nothing is ever bad, et cetera, et cetera. There's an aggressive narrative control. There's an escalation of failed policies. So if it failed, we obviously just continue trying it again to see if it works this time around. I believe after doing it enough times, we call that insanity. Hostility towards any dissenting opinions, any difference of opinion really whatsoever. It's usually gone after pretty aggressively after a while. And I think one of the things that we all ultimately see from this, and what we are starting to see from this, especially when you start calling people out on this, is you start to see this lawfare not between lawmakers, but the state essentially against the average individual, the person who lives in the country, the person who lives in the state. So we start to see that, and a moral certainty detached from outcomes. It's not, I want to be clear, right? Like, even though that we have the current administration that we do, okay, it's not confined to one administration or particularly one personality. We have Trump, we have Biden, we have individuals like Hegseth, Patel, Bongino, Bondi, and there's countless others. We saw many in the Biden era administration in particular, and previous administrations before that. So look, it's not, I want people to fundamentally understand, like, there's a pattern that shifts from one administration to the next. It's not particular necessarily to Trump or to Biden or back to Trump again or to Obama. We see this all over the place, right? When we look at these people, they do tend to take credit for wins that never fully materialize. We have a situation where they dismiss contradictory evidence or openly misrepresent outcomes that really help maintain their authority. They do everything they can to deflect, to avoid, to obscure, to pretty much segue away from anything that might be critical of whatever it is that they're doing. When we go through this episode, I want to use this episode to examine the United States as a sunk cost regime. And we'll kind of get into what that means here in a minute. A system that prioritizes protecting prior decisions over protecting liberty, prosperity, or truth, right? So the sunk cost fallacy as statecraft, what are we looking at here, okay? Well, essentially, in a, I guess, if you want to look at it in a potentially a psychological sense, sunk cost is continuing a failing action because of past investment. Like, oh, well, we can just continue to, we can just essentially continue to keep doing the same thing, even though it hasn't worked. We're too invested in this. We can't possibly go away. And this is essentially when it's like applied to power or to the state in general, right? Like this is kind of what this episode is on. In government, the sunk costs, as I'm about to elaborate on, escalation to protect legitimacy. So I think what we'll start to see here is this pattern of sunk cost fallacy applied to government, continuing bad or failing programs or policies or dispositions, despite the fact that they don't work, despite whatever, because there's too much of an investment or there's too much supposedly at stake in order to course correct, if you will. So let's take a look here, okay, as we move ahead. Once the state invests trillions in spending, okay, thousands of lives, years of propaganda, reputations of senior officials, stopping becomes politically, okay, and psychologically unacceptable. It can't even go into the realm of thought. This is something that to do so would be just totally reprehensible to them, right? So instead of actually correcting anything that's going wrong, what we end up seeing as a result of this is a metric manipulation. We have games that change the definition. We have moral absolutism, the expansion of enforcement powers, right? We see all of these things that start to grow, and ultimately what we end up having is this situation to where the goalposts are perpetually moved. And so it's never really getting to the point to where you're addressing the actual issue, as it is rather this situation where you're avoiding or you're continuing to do the same thing despite the fact that it hasn't been remotely successful in the least. Essentially, what we get with this is wars don't end, right? Agencies, they don't ever get smaller. Emergency authorities, they don't ever sunset, they don't ever go away, they don't ever expire. And furthermore, surveillance never really rolls back. Failure is no longer a policy problem in this examination. It is an existential threat to power. It's a threat to the power of those in government. It's the threat to power of or threat to the existence of the consolidated control and so many other areas like agencies that don't need to be around, right? This is what you're starting to get as you move forward. Now, let's wander into the realm of economy. Okay. The economy declaring victory while conditions just subsequently deteriorate, right? So this is where we start to get a little bit more into that sunk cost type of mindset. We always hear it doesn't really matter what administration it is. We hear it almost all the time, right? Inflation is under control. The economy is booming. It's strong. The wages are rising faster than the costs. We're outpacing, the costs. And this is a historic recovery of the economy. We hear it today. We've heard it during Biden. We heard it during the first Trump administration. We heard it during Obama. But in the end of the day, regardless of what marginal difference there may be here and there, I mean, in the end of the day, we're still in the same spot, essentially. And it doesn't matter how you try to reaffirm or how you try to evaluate it. We're still experiencing the same perpetual cycle and the same habitual movements and policies that haven't worked at all, with no change. And to admit the fact that, like, you know, that we have to change something, or that we have to course correct or change the direction and do whatever the case is, then it's essentially to admit that, like, oh, we were wrong, you know. And to admit that they're wrong would debase a lot of these people's own existence in government, you know, because they failed. They utterly failed. And so what you end up getting, what the actual impact here, what people experience, the real impact here is you have the fluctuation of food prices, right? You see food prices go up. You also see the effects on housing affordability, auto and home insurance premiums taking a sharp turn, right? Credit card debt, delinquency rates, we end up seeing small and mid-sized businesses reporting like a contraction or a squeeze or something like that. And it just goes on and goes on and goes on. And the mechanism here of sunk cost, rather than to acknowledge that there are monetary expansion effects, deficit spending consequences, and regulatory distortions, the state instead redefines inflation, right? It normalizes debt. It blames the global conditions. It goes on and insists that pain is temporary or necessary. And so you see, again, the shifting of the goalposts, and with no real shifting necessarily of the doctrine or the policy or whatever the case is. It's just, it's not, do not believe what your eyes are essentially telling you, right? Because you can't be right. The government must be right. This is their disposition. But from a liberty perspective, or at least a more liberty-oriented perspective, inflation can be seen as unlegislated taxation, right? We also see debt as binding future citizens, essentially our posterity, without consent, central banking, political insulation from accountability. So, you know, why would you have to be accountable or responsible when you can just print more and then just hope the problem goes away, which it never does? The founders viewed sound money as a restraint on tyranny, okay, not a technocratic choice. Doubling down, anyway, is ego preservation through coercion. Again, you have this dynamic, right, where looking back at what the sunk cost is, and in the dynamic that it plays with government is this, essentially this notion where, look, it's not doing anything good. You're constantly failing. You're constantly falling apart. There's nothing positive coming out from this. There's really nothing substantive that's being affected, or whatever the case is. But we're going to continue doing this. We're going to label it something else. We're going to move the goalposts, and everything is going to be fine. It's ignoring everything for the hubris or the narcissism or the egos of these people that supposedly are alleged to be our representatives, if you will. And it goes deeper than that, but I think you kind of get the gist of how it interacts at the economic level and kind of at the basic level here. Now, I think, aside from economics, what we also have too is we have an issue with infrastructure. And this is something that I think is very much more apparent to the average everyday person. We see claims, and I have to say, I see these claims also very locally, which is kind of, I wish I could say it's funny, but in the end of the day, it really isn't, because, you know, some poor, miniaturized Toyota probably gets trapped into these massive potholes that we experience. But you see these claims, right, of once in a generation infrastructure, right? Solid infrastructure, can't be beat. Transformational investment, historic funding levels, right? You always see these bloviated, these hyped up ideals and these notions surrounding infrastructure projects and how great the infrastructure is. However, what are the actual observable outcomes that we see? Well, roads and bridges are still structurally deficient, and it's not just in particular one area, but in many areas. Rail systems, there's issues, glaring issues that still exist within the rail systems. Utilities are fragile and they're starting to age out. You have project timelines that are undefined. Cost overruns are typically routine. There's always some excuse as to why we had to go over cost, why we can't get it done in a timely manner. Essentially, you start to see this diffusing or absenteeism surrounding accountability. There's always some excuse. There's always some reason as to why something can't get done or whatever the case is. But again, you have the sunk cost mechanism here to where it's never how it seems. If we've gone too far, we can't turn back now. We have to see this through. God forbid, we ever try to change the way that we do this and try to be a little bit more efficient. We just can't do it. It's not within the realm of possibility. And so as we move forward, the sunk cost logic, because funds were allocated, success must be presumed and not demonstrated, right? So we just have to assume it's going to be successful. God forbid we have to actually demonstrate it, and then you're really having to hold their feet to the fire. And more often than not, I feel like you just come up with nothing. It's a big nothing burger. And ultimately, if you do get any real result, it's just sad and it's whimsical and it's so lackluster. And meanwhile, you're investing. Well, I shouldn't say you're investing. The government is stealing money from you, and then it's in quote unquote investing into something, millions upon millions of dollars, in some cases billions of dollars, into a situation that produces little to no outcomes. And they're constantly telling you, well, there's this and this and this, and then the end result is just garbage. It's just garbage. That's all you get is garbage. And they try to gaslight you the entire way as to why you can't turn back, why you can't, go right at the Y versus why you can't go left at the Y, or whatever the case is. It's pretty crazy to me. It's mind-numbing. But this is the state of where things are at. It's not just in particular to one state, as that I think it kind of grows across the board in the United States in general. And I feel like this is a pretty typical thing for most governments. The failure, however, is referred to as administrative complexity. Here's some of the excuses: implementation delays or supply chain issues, right? You always see these diversionary things. And look, I'm not saying that there isn't potentially a supply chain issue or there's not some legitimate excuse, but oftentimes it's really more of a diversion to the point to where it becomes an excuse. It's like a habitual excuse. And then when none of these projects turn out the way that they're supposed to, they're not on time, they've had, these ridiculous delays, you're way over cost, whatever the case is, there's always this, this attempting to quell the expectation of like, well, it was hard, but we can't go back now. We've spent this much money. And it really does make you wonder, essentially, where was the planning in any of this? And I get that there are some greedy people out there and they're just using it as a way to milk bank accounts and to pad their own pockets. But in the end of the day, I really do think that there is essentially there is a mode of incompetence that has to play a role into the sunk cost type of situation, right? So it really just starts to expand and grow with no real direction. There's no real emphasis as to what the end game looks like. So in the end of the day, when we look at this, liberty-based governance demands delivery, accountability, and limits. Okay, can you deliver? Are you accountable for this, for the delivery of what it is you promise? And what are the limits? What are the restraints? What are the parameters in which this is to be done? Not permanent justification, right? A project should be well thought out. It should be well planned. There should be a blueprint, a roadmap, whatever, that the average person should be able to look at and be like, okay, this is what we're looking at. But instead, when you don't really supply any of that, you can just void any responsibility. You don't have to. I mean, heck, there's probably instances, and I wouldn't be surprised, where they don't even deliver on the product that they first set out to put forth. And when you have no limits, well, they can just keep raising the bar and making excuses as they go along. When we look at war and force, the realm of escalation without definition, we start to see a variety of different things, right? You have massive funding and arms transfers as it pertains to Ukraine. There's been no declaration of war, no defined victory conditions, no clear diplomatic end state. It seems like there is, but I mean, if we're being honest, they're just kind of running in circles. There's escalation justified as like, there's a realm of like credibility to it, like, oh, we're 100% sure, like it's very credible. We can do this or we can't do that. As it pertains to the Middle East, you have, an expanding U.S. involvement framed as like deterrence, right? Like has to be this realm of deterrence, repeated strikes without congressional authorization, no articulated strategy objective beyond posture. When it comes to Iran in particular, perpetual escalation rhetoric, it's always this thing to where Iran bad, Iran can never be good. They're the great evil. And a lot of this is egged on also in conjunction with Israel. You see sanctions, strikes, threats. There's no defined state other than, or defined end state other than just constant pressure. When we look at Venezuela, military strikes that are happening, I don't even know how many it has been. I think it's close to, last I saw, and I could be wrong on these estimates, I think it's close to 100 strikes on boats. But the crazy thing is the drug interdiction is legally and effectively handled by the U.S. Coast Guard. The U.S. Coast Guard has done this effectively. We know this. It's not just hyperbole. They put out reports, and their reports do confirm what it is that they do, and they do it very well. Military escalation bypasses constitutional war powers, risks escalation with a sovereign state, so all of these different things. And you could take some of these and you could bracket them up to some of the ones I just mentioned. And ultimately what you see here is you see these types of behavior. And what it is it's this growing situation where, oh, we're too far in now. We're in too deep. We can't go backwards. We can't pull out. We can't, change our direction. God forbid we do that. Then we're always looked at as weak, or we're always looked at as this, and blah, 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 blah. All the ridiculous excuses and whataboutisms and all of these other things. And ultimately what you end up getting is a situation that is rudderless. There's no roadmap. There's no blueprint. There's no defined goals. There's no set end game, nothing. And so you continue this dive down into the sunk cost, and there's nothing that changes. And it just creates more and more problems as you continue to go down. And, you can take what you're starting to see is you can take this and you can start to apply this to more than one type of situation. Sunk cost it's not something that just simply is applied to economics, albeit it is talked about economically, but it can apply to so many things. And when you talk about warfare and you look at all of the excuses, all of the whataboutisms, and all of these other, throwings off of accountability, it really just starts to add up, and you get this picture that's just absolute chaos. And, and these people, they will chase their egos, they'll chase their narcissism, their hubris, all to maintain a career, just to go into something different, and ultimately to better their position. And the end state of everything is it's either equal to or worse off than before they came into office. You're getting nothing in return for any of these things that I have mentioned so far previously. And so when we look at what the founders' standard was, right, the founders defined any act of aggression as war. There's no scale, threshold. There's no semantic loopholes. It was just any act of aggression was construed as war, right? The modern rebranding of Operations Kinetic Action exists to bypass Congress, essentially, to avoid accountability, normalizing perpetual warfare. And so the sunk cost logic is we're already involved. stopping would admit error. It would admit defeat. It would admit this, for whatever reason, this sense of weakness. When in reality, sometimes when you stop and you step back and you evaluate what the hell it is that you're doing, you can come out better from the other side. But we don't have people right now that are like that. We have very few people that have a rational sense of thought. I can think of maybe two people: Rand Paul, Thomas Massey. You might have somebody else, one or two other people that really are willing to step back and say, hey, maybe this isn't the appropriate way to do this. Maybe there's got to be something better. Maybe waging perpetual wars is not the idea. So essentially, it's this idea that whether it's war, economy, infrastructure, whatever the case is, it's this idea that they dig this massive hole, they overspend, they have no plan, they have no nothing, or they bypass the Constitution, they absolutely throw liberty and rights and will throw you right under the bus. And then they'll lie to you to your face as to like, well, we're in too deep now. We can't turn back. We can't turn back. Everything will collapse. Everything will fail. Everything. So we just continue to subsidize failure. That is their goal, is to continue subsidizing failure. So when we move forward outside of even just the warfare thing, and we look at the foreign relations as it pertains to tariffs, the Israel-Gaza thing, and moral asymmetry, when we look at tariffs imposed with promises of leverage, retaliation follows, consumer prices rose, supply chains were horribly disrupted, strategic benefit is really unclear. I remember at one point where, the Trump administration just started throwing tariffs out like it was going out of style. They threw tariffs out to places like Serbia and a few other places, and which made no sense. They couldn't even justify why they were doing it or what the purpose was in a clear, coherent area. It was just like, oh, well, we're getting ripped off by these people. Like, that's it? Like, okay, can you provide evidence? Can you show the source of what your evidence is? Can you elaborate? Like, the onus is on you as the government. You have to provide whatever it is, right? Before you can just do things without a reason. I mean, I guess they don't have to, but I mean, this is the state that we end up in. And so overall, what they do is they try to frame this with a sense of strength, like, oh, like we're strong, like we're leveraging, we have the conversational power, we have the ability to get out of this what we want. And it makes no sense. And again, you're just left with this realm of this sunken cost of this perpetual and habitual repeating of doing the same thing over and over again. You're getting nothing in return. If not, you're ending up worse, right? And it just makes you look foolish. It makes you look stupid. And so again, it's just another example of just a government or a bureaucracy or individuals within this apparatus that clearly have no idea what they're doing, why they're doing it, what the end goal is, what the end state is. And so you're just kind of left with the tatters and ruins of whatever you get. When you look towards something like Gaza and Israel, what do we see? We see diplomatic and military support is provided to Israel, right? Civilian casualties and infrastructure destruction are documented, but they're overwhelmingly they're overwhelmingly denied by everybody involved that it can't be Gaza. Every single Gazan is a terrorist. That's their whole shtick. Proportionality concerns are dismissed. It's all proportional. We just leveled 6 schools in like 3 hours, but that's proportional. We've destroyed almost every hospital there. There's nothing left but just concrete dust and excrement on the ground, but it's totally proportionate. Criticism is often labeled as extremist, or it's disloyal, or you're an anti-Semite, like that's their favorite thing. It's the same thing. It's the same stupid thing that all of these, individuals try to label somebody as like you're discriminatory, you're horrible, you're this, you're that. And really it's just falling on deaf ears. Nobody's buying it anymore, but it's still the shtick that they stick to because it's all that they know, and then from a natural rights and founders lens, as we pertain to these things, Look, they were wholly about non-interventionism, restraint, proportionality, were moral imperatives, right? These things were moral imperatives. Trade and goodwill towards others, right? There's no entangling alliances. There's no, overwhelming likeness to one country. There's no overwhelming hatred for another country. It was just, friendship, free, trade and goodwill. And so what we see is we see the inverse of all of this, and we see a walking contradiction today, to where we have this favoritism, we have an overwhelming hatred, and it really doesn't amount to anything more than a worsening condition for us. And we see a sunk cost in foreign relations and everything else subsequently, right? So, and that's not the only thing. There's a lot more that we start to see this. Again, it's not something that is specific or necessarily predisposition to one particular type of thing in general. We can see this when it comes to things like Epstein, right? You have a broad public awareness of unresolved questions. People are still asking questions, despite the efforts of Thomas Massie, who, if it wasn't for him, there wouldn't have been the pressure to get things released again. Thomas Massie was a huge driver of that. He poured on the pressure, and things started moving along. But there's an institutional silence. You have minimal accountability. You have rapid narrative closure. It's not a big deal. It's, we don't care about those things. But yet the irony there is, they have the nerve to talk about, certain things as it pertains to South America, drugs, human trafficking. And now it's all of a sudden, those things are a big deal, but we don't talk about Epstein, right? So it's really weird how they can't get their morals or their story straight as it pertains to one thing, but not the other. It's very bizarre. What we see as a pattern is power decides ultimately, right? Which failures linger, which scandals disappear ultimately, and which truths are permitted, oxygen, which ones are given life, which things are going to flourish and which things are just going to be stamped out like a fire. It's not a conspiracy, right? This is a pattern. This is a pattern, and it is institutional self-protection. These people will protect themselves well before that they'll protect any one of you or me or your neighbors, your family, your friends, whatever. They will throw all of us under the bus in order to maintain their own existence, right? This is something that does exist, and it's something that's existed for a long time. The legitimacy is maintained by controlling attention and not resolving any wrongdoing. And we see this type of behavior, this mentality, right, into warfare, foreign relations, whatever. And then they can try and craft a narrative. They can be dismissive. They can shirk responsibility, accountability. It doesn't really matter that much. They will tell you how wrong you are, how right they are, and they can try and create the outcome it is that they want, despite the fact of it just being more perpetuated insanity, right? So before we go ahead real quick, I want to go back here just a moment. And I want to kind of just evaluate one more time the sunk cost fallacy. What is this? I just want to refresh this just a little bit as we're moving along. Sunk cost, continuing a failing action because of past investment, and essentially reiterating the idea that we've come too far. We can't turn back now. If we turn back, it'll mean ruin. We can't possibly change this. We have to continue going in the direction that we're going. And ultimately, failure can no longer be a policy option, right? This is something that I think we see through all of these different examples. And it's becoming more evident as time goes on. And I hate to say it, but the Trump administration is really, really doing a good job of putting a magnifying glass on all of these issues and really making it a lot more apparent as time goes on. I mean, in my personal opinion, this whole first year so far has been nothing short of an absolute dumpster fire. And so much of the goodwill that has existed or that had existed up until his election and maybe somewhat into his election is being systematically destroyed. And you can't, there's no one else to blame. There's no one else to blame other than the administration, the people within the administration, and the things that they're doing. It's just that, you can try and shift the blame all you want, but it doesn't matter. They are the ones wholly that are responsible for this, right? So let's get into something else here. Let's talk about the domestic consequences, the surveillance, and the police and border. So surveillance, right, is an expansion justified by foreign threats. Essentially, we have authorities or authority given that's never been rolled back. Financial monitoring increases. So remember, they monitor your bank accounts now. So if you deposit a no amount of money, or you want to take a no amount of money, according to them, well, you have to explain why it is that you need to take that amount of money out of your bank account. You have to justify why it is that you have to take a certain amount of money out of your bank account, which is one of the most insane things for a country that considers itself free. The average person can't just take whatever amount of money out of their bank account without having to justify it to the government. That is reprehensible in and of itself for a variety of reasons. And then you have speech regulation, which is framed as security, right? You have this ridiculousness. You see them, they try to preserve their narratives. You can't speak, for a long time, you couldn't speak about Ukraine. You couldn't talk about certain things about Ukraine. Ukraine still has a little black book of people they'd like to kill, let's be honest. And it comes through even more so when we look at Israel and we look at other places that very much have the ear and have the will of the American bureaucrats in Washington. And they tell them, hey, we don't like what these people are saying, so you need to ban them, boycott them, destroy their lives, destroy their businesses, tear apart their homes. We don't like it. They come in here, they start helping craft and create policy decisions, which also, might I mind you, whether it's speech regulation, whether it is policy regulation, whether it is sending money to another country, I just want to leave a little nugget here for you real quick. If you have bureaucrats, if you have the people that you elected in office that are wanting to send your money that you were taxed on, right? They want to take the money that was taxed from you, stolen from you, and send it to another country to support another country. Those people, in my mind, are not only not loyal to their own country, right? They don't care about you in totality. They would rather see you on the streets, and they would rather see you dying in a hospital bed, and they would much rather see you in squalor than ever give you a penny to or allow you to maintain your pennies, right? For your betterment, right? These people would rather spend money overseas supporting tin pot dictatorships and absolute barbarians and countries that shove people into vans and send them up to the front lines of a war than ever do anything to help you with any of the above issues, mind you, fixing infrastructure, creating a better quality of life, whatever the case is. They would much rather give your money away to all these places and serve their interests rather than do the things that you expect them to do. That should be very telling for you, by the way. And when we look at policy and we look at legislation, and they're doing it with that, which fundamentally can change the landscape of our country, not to mention our states individually, well, who do they serve at this point? And if they're not serving the American people, then they need to be dealt with in the appropriate way, right? In a way that is going to get somebody in there that is going to do the job the way that it needs to be done. But that being said, people need to step up and be able to move into those positions. You can't simply just walk away or ignore it or say, I don't want to do that. If you don't want to do that, that's fine, whatever, but somebody has to fill that void. We need people of character. We need people of principle to fill that void. Look, there's so many places that are in a situation where they need somebody to come in, not only fill that void, but it's almost the situation demands it. It demands it beyond a need, right? So I just want to put that out there, that if you want something to change, you've got to get involved, and you can't sit on the sidelines and just expect something to change. It is not enough to complain and be dissatisfied. Take that energy, that fervor, go forth and do something about it. This is the way that you start to create that change. Without somebody willing to do that, nothing is going to change. And well, I shouldn't say it won't change. It may change for the worse, but you get my point. When we look at policing, we have military equipment normalized, federalization of law enforcement. We also see counterterrorism doctrine applied domestically. This is something that's been very abundant. When it comes to the border, we see laws exist but are selectively enforced. Chaos is tolerated because fixing it admits failure. And then we look at costs externalized to the states and communities. In addition, crisis rhetoric used to justify more federal power. So what's interesting here is there's two things immediately that I brought up that I want to really put a focus on here, right? Never let a good crisis go to waste. How do you justify an enlarging of government without having a crisis? Well, when you look at the chaos that's tolerated and you tolerate it, you're fomenting crisis. If you allow that to happen and you create fear, you create discontent, you create confusion, you create crisis, you can justify the overgrowing, or ever expanding federal architecture or this police state mentality in order to justify your existence or an agency's existence. Well, we need to be here. We're too far down the road now. We can't go back. Look at what happened. Look at what they said with the Patriot Act. Oh, it's only going to be used for terrorism. It's only going to be used to track terrorists. Well, by and large, who does it track more today? I'll let you decide that. But I can tell you right now that this is a system that has been used very much so to target the average American. We've seen this pattern time and time and time and again. So, I mean, these people will create a crisis, or they will use a crisis to justify the existence of whatever agency, whatever doctrine, whatever policy, law, legislation they want to push. And then you get the sunk cost situation with all of these things in order to justify why they can't turn back, right? Even if they're utter, complete failures, they will justify why they need to do it. It's not a compassion, right? It's an abdication plus expansion. They're abdicating their duties. And it's not just for it's not just a situation for the border. It's so many other things, right? It's so many other things. When we break this down a little bit more as it pertains to entrenched power, there's observable behaviors, right? Hypersensitivity to criticism. There's a reflexive self-praise, right? It's like, we're the greatest in the world. We can't ever be wrong. We're the most powerful. We can't be defeated. There's no faults, no failures, no failures, nothing wrong. We can't be beat. It's at what point, at what point do you have to realize that people are not just going to continue buying this perpetual self-masturbation. Moral certainty without any form of evidence to support it, dismissal of dissent. And then we look at, officials. They claim success prematurely. They redefine metrics post hoc. And then they attack critics rather than even provide a reasonable response in return. It's the psychology of an unrestrained authority, and furthermore, power that cannot admit error must control the narrative, right? And eventually, controlling speech. When we look at what the founders have to say here, they have a couple different accounts. Madison says that no nation could preserve freedom in the midst of continual warfare. Washington, overgrown military establishments are inauspicious to liberty. Jefferson goes forward and says the natural progress of things is for liberty to yield and government to gain ground, which essentially is putting out a call forth to the average person like, look, we have to be aware. We have to be well-read. We have to understand these things. We have to be vigilant. We have to be the safeguards of our republic. They warned that war expands power, debt enslaves posterity, fear centralizes authority, and denial destroys republics. Denial, delusion, there's a lot of words for it there. What we are witnessing is not novel, right? It is the fulfillment of whatever their warnings were, whether it's those in particular or the other ones that they're very well famous for. When we look at what the next area is here, okay, some people, it's going to be kind of a response to what some people are, and then this will kind of be the wrap up. But, you know, some people might say, well, but what do we do? What is the course correction? What is the methodology of being able to fix some of these things? Okay, a liberty and constitutional path forward, if you will, which is where I prefer to come from. So before I close, it's important to answer the question that inevitably comes up. You know, if all of this is in fact true, what do we actually do about this? The founders never believed liberty survived on outrage alone, right? They believed it survived through structure, restraint, decentralization, and courage. These are some of the merits and some of the virtues and values and principles that we need. It's not about fixing everything overnight. I think that's a big misconception that people generally have, is if it doesn't fall in line with our immediate changes idea, this instant gratification culture that we have, which I would say there is a large cultural hurdle that we have to overcome, then they don't want it. But look, it was said before, and I believe it was Jefferson. I could be wrong. I believe it was Jefferson that said essentially that liberty must be gained in increments, right? It's not something that you're going to do overnight or it's going to be instantaneous. And when it's done in increments, right, it has more staying power. It has more lasting power. It has the ability to be carried from one generation to another, albeit it's not generational. You have the ability to teach the next generation. If you're not teaching the next generation, then, you know, what are you left with at that point? I would argue that you're left in tatters and ruins and in actual legitimate crisis and chaos, right? It's about restoring conditions, however, where liberty can start to breathe again. And I think this is very important. We have to be in a restoration phase. We have to start restoring. We have to find that courage. We have to find the will to be involved. And that means you may have to make sacrifices. We all must understand that there are sacrifices that would be made in order for the betterment of our future. So as it pertains to war, right? Let's evaluate here real quick. And there's going to be a couple, so don't jump away just yet. We have to restore constitutional war powers. We have to totally end executive war by default. The single most dangerous engine of the sunk cost state, if you will, is undeclared war. What must be restored? Now, you might be wondering about that. Well, I may have a few things here for you. Congress must reclaim exclusive authority to initiate war. Any act of aggression must require formal declaration, defined objectives, cost disclosures, and sunset clauses, leaving no potential for anything to be continued. No more police actions. It's got to be done away with. No more kinetic operations, special military actions, proxy wars, you know, with no accountability. All of this stuff has to go. And there's a lot more to that list, but I think you kind of see where this is going. The liberty principle for this, however, if war is easy to start, liberty will always be the first casualty. Truth is also the first casualty of a war, right? So these are some of the necessary steps that we must start building towards. It's not going to happen overnight, but we must start building towards really taking a spot. We must start taking responsibility as individuals and really start becoming involved in pouring on the pressure to make this happen. It's not easy, but we have to be a part of this. We are an accountability mechanism. The second portion is enforcing sunset clauses on emergency powers. This is a no-brainer, right? Emergency powers are supposed to be temporary, albeit we know that they aren't. Anytime the government gains power, it never will willingly relent that power. In practice, they are permanent, right? So we know this. So what are the fixes? Mandatory expiration dates need to be on surveillance authorities, emergency declarations, national security powers, and regulatory waivers. And on top of that, I would argue that we also have to check this against constitutionality. We have to check this against violations of liberty and rights. We have to make sure that these things are thorough, they're concise, they're easy to understand, and they're well-defined. That way, there's no question whatsoever as to what, when, and how these things are to be done and done away with. No renewal should take place without public justification, constitutional review, and legislative supermajority. The founders' logic, power that never expires, was never an emergency power. It was tyranny waiting to happen. Okay? When we think about that, I think it really evokes a sense of, well, yeah, duh. It's one of those things that I feel is fairly obvious to a lot of people, but oftentimes you're told that something is occurring and you kind of accept it. And then you don't ever really pay it much attention, and it just continues to maintain itself, right? I think that's exactly what they were getting at. Decentralized power back to the states and the people. The founders did not build a centralized managerial state, right? The course correction would require essentially the following: reassertion of the 10th Amendment, reduction of federal administrative agencies, well, that's a no-brainer, return of policing infrastructure and public policy to local and state control, right? Refusal by states to enforce unconstitutional federal overreach. And we also have to consider that liberty survives where power is close, so keeping it close, accountability is visible, and escape from bad governance is possible. We have to end the culture, in addition, of too big to fail government programs. If a private enterprise fails, it must adapt or die. Government programs never die, they metastasize. We have to get rid of this idea of constant subsidies. We have to be willing to allow things to fail in order to move forward in a better, more effectual manner. So the fixes: automatic audits of large federal programs, mandatory termination dates unless reapproved, and furthermore, the elimination of programs that fail to meet stated outcomes, right? If a program cannot justify itself, it should not exist. And I would argue, honestly, even if it can manage to justify itself, I would like to add a little bit more to this that perhaps I didn't in my notes. Even if it can manage to justify itself, we should also aggressively check it against the Constitution and whether or not it has a justifiable existence against it, as in comparison to whether it aligns or not, but also whether it abridges the liberty and rights of the people that it asserts itself alongside or over, right? And no matter how much was already spent. If a program cannot justify itself, it should not exist. Which I said that, yeah, okay. No matter how much was already spent, right? So the liberty principle here is past spending does not justify future coercion. Just because you had past spending, just because it existed, does not give you the green light to just continue to move forward. Reassert sound money and fiscal restraint. Debt is not neutral. At least in a sense, if you will. Inflation is not something that's always like accidental. Both are tools of control. When we look at course correction, it may include these things. And if I have my economist on, you know, or if my economist, my wonderful economist, Tom, happens to see this, he may correct me. That's fine. That's what we're all here for. But we'll move forward here. Course correction includes ending endless deficit spending, serious scrutiny of monetary expansion, okay, restoring transparency to fiscal policy, rejecting emergency economics as permanent governance. And the founders understood that debt enslaves a posterity, so our future, quietly, legally, and permanently. When we look at protection of speech, dissent, and perspective, especially when it's uncomfortable, a free society does not fear disagreement. Liberty requires absolute protection of political speech, rejection of censorship framed as safety, protection for whistleblowers, tolerance for dissent during war and crisis. Okay? If a policy cannot survive criticism, it is not legitimate, it is not constitutional, and it is not compatible with liberty. Truth must be allowed to interrupt power. And then furthermore, and I believe this is my final point here, education on the Republic. We have to go through like a sense of like a renaissance of bringing forth education on the Republic, right? Not the empire. Perhaps most importantly, the founders placed the maintenance of the Republic on the people themselves. Again, the impetus is on you and me. Liberty cannot be delegated. It cannot be outsourced. It cannot be automated, right? Liberty is inherent within us. A free people must understand constitutional limits, reject empire thinking, resist emotional governance, and demand restraint even when afraid. Washington warned the preservation of liberty requires eternal vigilance, not periodic outrage, not blind loyalty. Vigilance was the impetus. So I want to close out with this, and then I'll go through and I'll take a look at some of the comments here. I appreciate everybody who has been on here. I really appreciate you staying with me here for this long. So the closing thought: the courage to stop. The solution is not perfection, right? That is not. It's not to be perfect. Even our founders understood this. It was to be a more perfect union, but they understood perfection was, you know, kind of a delusion to some degree. It is the courage to stop, however. Stop escalating failed policies. Stop redefining failure as being success. Stop surrendering liberty for pride, and stop confusing power with strength. A government that cannot stop will eventually demand obedience. We've seen this. We know this. A people who cannot say enough will lose everything quietly. Liberty survives only where correction is still possible. And we have to make these possibilities, right? And correction begins with restraint. That is the impetus. That is the lesson that we are told. This is the type of principle and the direction and the blueprint that our founders overwhelmingly expected of us. They understood that vigilance and being involved was essential to maintaining our republic. And it's no different today. Now, something that I would say in closing is, well, I do think it is important to look to the past to understand what the purpose was, what the principles were, what the meaning was. We cannot live in the past. We have to live both in the moment today and looking towards the future. We have to look to see, with the lessons of the past, what we can affect and how we can affect it today, and be able to manifest that and be able to work with that for a better future. It lies with us. It is implied to be our responsibility and our duty. So with that being said, I'm going to take a moment here to address a couple of the comments. I really appreciate you guys and gals taking the time to listen to what it is that I had to say today. And I saw that there's a couple decent comments here. So I'm going to go through here and just do some looking. So welcome, everybody, or thank you, rather. Welcome. Thank you to Chuck and David and Gene and everybody else who stopped in. I really, really appreciate it. And so I will see. So we can't buy cars or motorbikes. This is from Gene. With cash from dealers, right? When new as the police will be called and will only use, and we can only use bank transfer or hire purchase and credit cards. Yeah, I mean, what's amazing to me too is I don't remember when it became a thing, but for a long time now, I think there was a weird thing too, to where like, and this might just be an industry thing, but I always found it weird as well that hotels now pretty much require some type of a card. And I get that that's kind of like a liability thing, but I always thought that it was kind of odd. You know, I mean, that's an individual policy, but when you, oh gosh, when you look at dealerships, right, there's videos of people going into dealerships and willing to pay with cash. And it is amazing how there is this presumed idea of guilt, right? Of just like, oh, you're coming in with cash, you must be dealing drugs, you must be some type of criminal element, you must, whatever the case is. There's always this presumption of guilt. And look, I get it. Like you may have an industry, right, to where you attract some unsavory characters from time to time, but it is definitely a business decision. I mean, if somebody has the ability to pay with cash and they have the ability to pay it off right there and then, I've never evaluated that myself personally as something that is necessarily indicative of any type of criminal behavior. I think I think that's just, I think it's very misdirected. And I think to some degree, there tends to be a situation where somebody's experiences obviously influence this. And I think that's a given. And overall, it really can kind of divide the type of people that you get coming in. If they know that they can't pay with cash with you, you know, you may be missing out on some great purchases. You might be missing out on some lifetime customers. I mean, it's all a personal decision. But when you have the government that comes in and they have to be involved with a transaction, it becomes more than that even, right? Especially if it becomes like a government mandated policy. And when they start putting in more of a legal framework with this, it becomes very, very problematic. And when, you know, I think about that, especially when you go to take money out of your bank account or you go to put a certain amount of money in your bank account. It's none of the government's business how much money you're putting in or how much money you're taking out. That's none of their business. It's not their business or responsibility to be tracking that type of thing. We are individuals. We have the ability to live our life as we please, so long as it's not affecting the rights and liberties of other people. And if we happen to be successful, if we happen to do well for ourselves, where is it within the government's responsibility to sit there and question every single person? Now, I don't, you know, there's none. It's just this idea of making a criminal out of somebody who otherwise would be living a perfectly normal life. And look, you know, there's a lot of people that like the idea of thought crime. They like the idea of preventative crime, but preventative crime doesn't work. You look at so many laws on the books today, and this idea of preventative crime, again, it's a sunk, you can even see a sunk cost fallacy in preventative crime, to where they're like, oh, well, we have to continue doing this type of thing because, you know, at some point that, you know, we can turn back, you know, because we've already gone down here. But it's like, you can. You absolutely can. You know, this, we see things like the war on drugs. We see things like, you firearms laws, and we see all of these different things. And I would even put monetary law in there as well, where there's laws pertaining to monetary transactions. And it's like, you're fishing for a crime. They're making a crime out of thin air, and before it even happens. So you're already finding this person guilty. And that is not a just form of governance. It's not a just form of judicial process. It's this presumption of you're guilty. So every person, quite frankly, every person that walks around today, you're already considered guilty of something due to the laws and legislation that's on the books today. You're already considered guilty of something before you've ever commissioned any type of a crime. That's just the way that things are set up right now. And this presumption of guilt, really, it's not stopping crime. It's never stopped crime before it's happened. We've seen this. I know that there's going to be people, there's investigate. Yeah, there's a difference between an investigation and a preventative law. Preventative law, it doesn't do anything, right? And that's never even, when you look at the way that the legal system was set up back, when we became a country and subsequently afterwards, there was a firm belief that when the commission of a crime is done, when you know that this person committed this crime, then they were guilty. And then you could charge them with the crime and provide them a sentence after or before a jury of their peers, right? Once the peers have gone through the process and they've either found you guilty or not guilty, whatever the case is, we have a legal process for this. And only then do you get your deliberation. If you're found guilty, then you serve the sentence that is befitting of your crime. So this preventative idea is repugnant to me. It's ridiculous. But I really appreciate the comment there, Gene. And yeah, I mean, we see this in many different places now. So let's see here. So there's a question here by David. At what point will it take for the government to call out, or for the people to call out our government on continued lying and BS when they speak to us, the American people? I would argue it happens already. What I think a lot of people have to understand is in many ways, most of the algorithms are never just going to feed you everything you want to see. I think one of the biggest mistakes that a lot of people make is they just wait to see something happen. And then as a result, if all you do is wait to see if something's going to happen, you tend to miss 100 other things that are already happening. We have whistleblowers, we have industry insiders, we have people that have come out, they've talked about these things. And there are quite a few instances where people have been held accountable because the amount of evidence or the way of recourse is, the evidence is so substantial, or the way of recourse is not possible for these government officials, that they have to do something about it. And so there are a number of cases throughout our history to where this has happened, but you got to understand, like, a lot of these media personalities and a lot of these media organizations are very much in bed with the government, right? They may act as independent entities, but they're very much in bed with the government. We know this for a fact. We've seen the money trails, and they're not going to do something that's going to upset the people that ultimately direct what it is that they say, right? People can disagree with me all you want. That's fine. That's okay. I'm open and I understand that. But in the end of the day, like, these people are not going to diminish the people that they likely are very good friends with. They have a relationship with, they have contracts with. So you have to find alternative sources, and you have to be willing to look for these things. These cases do exist. These instances do exist. And I wouldn't say that they're necessarily as obscure as everybody makes them out to be. It's just most of the algorithms are not going to put them in your face because they're not advantageous to that relationship of that media company and the government. It's unfortunate, but that's quite frankly a large case. It's kind of how it is. So let's see here. Gene has another great one. Also not allowed to withdraw more than 5K a day without giving a good reason and 4 days notice. No houses can be bought in cash and not allowed to bank more than 33,000 a day unless a business. Yeah, no, I mean, we have some things I think that are similar here in the United States along those veins, Gene. And again, it's this, I do really evaluate this as like a real presumption of guilt. Like you're guilty of something. We don't know what it is, but you're guilty of something. And it's a very, very dangerous, totalitarian, authoritarian type of approach to maintain control. Like it's them fishing for an excuse to find a problem or to find a crime, manufacture a crime that otherwise doesn't exist, typically. And then they can have their way with you. They need to be able to control the transactions that you do in your life to justify the existence of X, Y, or Z. One here by Chuck and Money. All laws should sunset after a period of time. I wouldn't be opposed to that. I think if there's a good, solid, logical way that we could set up a framework like that, it would be interesting to see how that goes about at scale, if that makes sense. I do think the only thing that I have is I do think there's some pretty hard and fast legal areas. I think like murder wouldn't sunset. I think theft and robbery is another one of those things. There's you have a variety of other, I think, types of legal interactions that two people can have with one another that I think are pretty hard. But I would say that there's a lot of laws in a lot of forms of legislation that I think you could probably sunset a lot of them. I do think there are some more likely that probably you can't really do away with them per se, because then it starts to create problems in and of itself. And look, I mean, I would even frame it in the sense of like, somebody could take that position, but then when it's your family member that gets murdered by somebody, you're going to want retribution. So, I mean, that's kind of where I think people would end up there. But I mean, it's a conversation, right? There's a conversation there, and I think it would be interesting to see how people would explore that and navigate that conversation for sure. Those words from your great founding fathers were awesome and should be listened to. Otherwise, they are pointless. Gene said that. I mean, that was the intent behind a lot of the things that they said. And moreover, not just what they said, but they lived what they said. They did what they said. And I think that was the thing that was really implied with how they went about founding this country is the impetus was on us. And so we have to be living, we are living manifestations of what we're willing to accept and what we're willing to tolerate. And I do think, I had a discussion earlier today with somebody whom I consider a friend and who catches a show every once in a while. And, we talked about that there is a large cultural issue, and without a shift in culture, you're not going to really see a shift in some of these other things. I do think it's possible. I think history and patterns show that this is possible, but again, you can't rush it, right? Anytime that you rush something, it becomes a mess, and it becomes very much the opposite of typically what you want to see. So, but you're not wrong, Gene. You're not wrong at all. You are guilty until proven guilty. Nowadays, if you can think of a crime, you are guilty of that crime. Thought Police, aka 1984. I think you're 100% right, Gene. There is a really heavily heavily implied point nowadays in modern governance. And it's not, obviously, it's not just the United States. Matter of fact, I would argue that there are many or several European countries that are way worse off than we are when it comes to this. And just the mere idea of, standing outside of like an abortion clinic, for instance, and like praying is enough to get some people arrested in places like the UK. And and it's like, well, there's a crime that's committed. Okay, well, what's the crime? And they can't actually come up with a crime, so they have to manufacture one. They say it's disturbing the peace. Well, whom are you disturbing? And it's just petty. It's just super petty. And when we look at kind of extensions of that, there's a guy from your side of the pond there, Gene, who took pictures when he went out shooting. And the police showed up at his door when he got home, and he got in trouble for it. It was a picture. It was a simple picture of when he was on vacation. I believe it was in Florida. So it is amazing the extent that but again, it is what you're willing to tolerate. It's what you're willing to deal with. And in the to some degree, there is the institutions and the governments that we have, to some degree, are a manifestation of what it is we're willing to accept. Chuck makes a response here. Murder law would be reapproved instantly if it is sunset, not an issue. Yeah, and that's where I think that there could be a broader conversation. I think it's one of those conversations that I personally feel it would be good to sit down, over coffee, or it would be something that I think is, again, it still deserves consideration, right? It still deserves like a good dialogue, because the amount of I think that there's nuance to that conversation, more than I think I can respectively give it this evening. But it's one of those conversations I do find kind of intriguing, since you brought it up. So I thank you very much. Appreciate it, Chuck. And thank you, everybody, for swinging by the Sentinels of Liberty podcast. I really appreciate it. Make sure to swing back next Saturday at 1700 Central Time for the next episode of the Sentinels of Liberty podcast. Until then, go with liberty, carry that flame inside you, get active, get involved, and be the difference that you want to see. Redbeard out. Steel-clad fist!